that the first thing that I'm asked for is to connect to a turbine. And I'm going to connect as an administrator for this webinar so that I can do everything within the application. Here we go. That's the front-end application, and the front-end application allows you to configure in detail all of these input queues that you find on the left-hand side, all of the output queues that you find on the right-hand side. But, and this is kind of unique to tFlow production, not only does it allow you to set up the automated parts of the workflow, but tFlow production, the front-end application, also allows you to work with files in a manual way if that is what you want to do. So you can really mix automated and manual processing in one application. You can see that there are three big parts to the application. I already mentioned the input and the output queues on the left and the right-hand side. The middle part is this archive or repository that I talked about. And depending on your settings, files will remain in this repository for a certain number of days. And you can choose whether they stay there for 7 days, for example, or whether they stay there forever or not at all. It's configurable. But the advantage of keeping files in the repository is that you can inspect them, see what is happening with a file, and then do some manual operation on that. And we'll come back on all of that. Of course, the first thing that you would normally do in an environment like this is set up a way for files to enter the application, and that is an input queue. And then, on the other hand, define a number of ways for files that will be generated and that you will use either on the internet to send back to customers, to send to a specific device, whatever your particular workflow is. These queues are used to do exactly that, and all I have to do is click on a queue, and when I click on it, I can see the files that are either being processed by that queue or have been processed. And all of the files in the Office files input queue have been processed. But if I go to the COIK queue, for example, you can see that a number of files here remain in the list, and that all of them have a red cross in front of them. The reason for that red cross in front of them, of course, is that there were a number of errors as the file entered that input queue, and the file is now held in the input queue so that I can either accept or reject it. Now, what are the things I can set up in that input queue, and how exactly does that work? There is a configuration button next to the name of the input queue, and if I click that, tFlow production shows me all of the different settings for the input queue, and that will explain why the files are in there with a red cross next to them. So if I click on that configuration and we go look at what the settings are for this CMYK input queue, then the first thing that I can configure is the actual processing of the files as they enter tFlow production. Processing is done by Kala's PDF Toolbox in the background, and that means that I can select either a built-in PDF Toolbox profile that I have in tFlow production, and you have a number of the most common profiles built right into as default profiles into the tFlow production application. Or if I have PDF Toolbox Desktop and I have designed my own profile, I can upload that profile to the tFlow production server, and from that point on, that's the profile that is going to be used. Next, I can decide what needs to happen with files that generate warnings or errors. And what I've done in this case is I've said if a file generates a pre-flight error while it's being pre-flighted with the profile that I select here, then I want to hold that file in the input queue. And that's why in the list of for the CMYK input queue, you had those files with a red cross in front of them. If I uncheck that, then any file that enters the system will still generate those pre-flight errors, and I will still be able to consult the report, but they will just flow into the archive, into the repository, and they will not be held into the input queue. So settings for pre-flight errors and pre-flight warnings and what needs to happen in those cases. And this is also quite unique to tFlow production and the way it handles things. Of course, I can choose to flatten transparencies inside of the PDF Toolbox profile that I have created, but throughout tFlow production, you will find easy to use checkboxes for a number of very commonly used settings or fixes. In this case, I can choose to flatten all transparencies, not by inserting that into the profile that I use, but by simply checking the flatten transparencies checkbox. And you'll see this concept come back in a number of different locations. The second tab here is color conversion, and there I can choose between either not touching colors at all or using an ICC profile, specifying an ICC profile, and then having all files that enter in this particular queue being converted to that ICC profile that I specify. And again, there is an easy to use way to convert spot colors into CMYK that I have, of course, selected for the CMYK only input queue. Workflow links then allows me to set up a fully automated workflow. First of all, what you can see here is that I have chosen to save files into my repository folder forever, but I could also say I want to keep the production files for the last week, for example, and then they are purged from the archive. But, and perhaps even more importantly, in this workflow links section, I can link output queues together with this input queue. So what I can set up is a way for each file that comes in through this CMYK input queue to be sent automatically to one or more output queues. And in this example, what I've chosen to do is any file that enters through CMYK queue is automatically sent to the Internet Publishing output queue and to the create proof on Epson 7900 output queue. If I want to, I can add additional links and also, for example, send that to an indoor poster queue and generate in this way, generate a third type of output file. So this really gives you a way to accept files into an input queue. If they are correct, if they don't generate errors or warnings, they will be sent automatically into one or more of these output queues. And we'll look at what you can do in an output queue in a second. And then the last setting that I have here is a way to notify someone if a file comes in. So send an email notification. In the turbine, you saw the setup possibilities for the mail server and so on. Those are, of course, the settings that will be used to send those notifications. Here, you merely specify the email address. Whenever a file comes in, an email will be sent out. Okay, let me go back to the application. We'll close this queue for a second. You saw that link to the output queues. Well, let's have a look at what is in those output queues. And what I'll do is I'll have a look at Internet Publishing. That was one of the output queues that was used in the CMYK input queue example. So again, same system. I have a little gear icon next to the name. If I click that, I now look at the setup for that particular output queue. It begins, or it looks very much the same as on the input side, but you'll see that the options are different and are aimed more, not so much at accepting files, but are aimed at generating correct production files for whatever workflow you happen to set up. The first step, again, is a possibility to select a profile. And of course, it's more logical here to have profiles that contain fix-ups to convert a file so that it becomes suitable for a particular purpose. And what I've done here is create a profile that is called Internet Publishing that will do a number of operations. This could be downsampling images, it could be color conversion, it could be anything that you want to do to make that file suitable for this particular purpose. Of course, I can again select a profile that is built into tFlow production as an example profile, or with this little arrow button, upload a profile that I've created in PDF Toolbox Desktop. The flattened transparencies is, of course, here as well. So you have the same easy to use options in the output queue as well. And there is a way to keep files into the output queue as well. So this would allow me to keep a copy of any file that was prepared in the Internet Publishing output queue. When I go to color conversion, you'll see that it is very different from what you had on the input side. On the input side, there was the possibility to convert a file with an ICC profile. You still have that possibility here, but there is a whole new section here that allows you to use the color logic capabilities as it comes to color. And that means that, for example, I could choose to run an ink saving profile on the file that I'm going to send to this output queue. Now, this does not make much sense for the Internet Publishing queue, but if you're preparing files for an actual print process, the fact that you can have these ink saving or tack reduction profiles in here is a very big help. The profiles that you have here are profiles from Color Logic, are the profiles that they sell as their device link sets together with their Copra and Zebra applications. So I can choose to do that. I can also choose to simply apply a compensation curve on the documents that pass through here if that is what I want to do as well. So either you change colors, you run compensation curves, or you could decide to do absolutely nothing to these documents as well, of course. And again, there is a little overlap between what you have here in these easy to use settings and the profile, because of course a lot of the color conversion settings can be specified in the Calas PDF Toolbox profile that you use in the output queue as well. The same possibility is to send an email notification to someone if a file was processed by an output queue in this case. But in this example, or in this case of an output queue, you also have the possibility to send that file once it is ready, send it to an FTP server. And that would mean that you prepare the file within tFlow production, and then you upload it automatically to an FTP server. And of course, perhaps send a notification email to someone notifying them that this has happened. The last stage is the ability to then apply an imposition scheme on those files as well. All of these, like I said in the beginning, are part of the output queue and will happen automatically as soon as a file enters that particular output queue. And as we've seen in the input queue, one of the possible ways of doing that is by linking output queues to input queues and creating a fully automated system. But, and this is very interesting, what I can also do is simply grab a file that I have in the repository and move that on top of any of the output queues that I have here. And that would allow me to automatically send that file I had in the repository to that particular output queue where it will be processed. Now, what do you use this repository for? You already saw me drag something to an output queue. The green blinking light that you have here indicates that that output queue is processing that file as we speak. But there are more things you can do with this repository, of course. First of all, it offers me a way to look at the file either in a list or a thumbnail preview mode. And if I select something in this repository, then I have this pane at the bottom where I can see all of the information for that particular file. Information meaning this is information that was extracted from the file while it was being pre-flighted by PDF Toolbox. So you have information on the separations that are in there. I have 4 separations in this, or channels in this file. You have the page size in here. If the file is PDFX compliant, PDFX version will be mentioned. So a number of characteristics about the file that I have selected here. For example, this particular document only contains 3 separations instead of the 4 that we saw in the brochure for PDF Toolbox. I can also look at metadata in the file, and this shows me the information that I have in the XMP information or XMP data for the file in the archive. And I can have a look at whatever was fixed by PDF Toolbox, meaning if I select for my input queue a profile that contains fixes, then any fix that is actually executed on the document will be listed here. In the same way, if warnings are detected while I send this file through pre-flight, or I have pre-flight errors in the document, then those will be listed in here as well. So for this particular file, there are 3 warnings in the document, one about line width, one about, and 2 actually about small text in the document. So all of this information could be used in a more manual workflow. If you want to set this up in such a way that there is no automatic link between input and output, then I can choose to look at the files in the repository as they come in, and then from the repository simply drag them to the output queue that I want once that I verified that this document is correct. And of course, you can mix those two. In my example setup, I have a number of workflows where the input queue is linked to one or more output queues. I have a number of others where the process is manual. And for example, for Office files, I have here decided that this should be a manual process. Files come in through the Office files input queue. They are converted to PDF, and a profile will be executed on them. But after that, they stay in the repository so that I can look at them and then decide whether they need to be sent or can be sent to an output queue. Now, this gives me information about the file. In most cases, of course, it's interesting to see the file in a little bit more detail. And by simply double-clicking on it, I can go to the 3rd viewing mode in the repository, and that gives me a larger preview of that document. So in this case, I have a 4-page document, and I could choose to scroll through the pages, and it will take just a second to generate these pages for this document. It's pretty big. Scroll through the pages, look at it in a little bit more detail, and then decide whether or not it is good enough. I can look at the pages individually. I can also, and again, this is probably not a very good example document. I should take something that is a little bit smaller for this this demo. I can also look at individual separations for this for the document. So if you want to see whether the separation of the colors in the document was done correctly, then you can inspect that here as well. And even, and let me go back to the thumbnail view for a second. and find something with a number of pages in there. This one, for example, I even have the ability to go to an imposition tab where I could say, this document I need as a booklet. I'm going to add crop marks. I want a 5mm border in this document, and generate an imposed document based on those settings. And the built-in imposition capabilities are booklet. The more generic imposition capabilities and then step and repeat is possible as well. So that's the imposed document. I have trim marks that were added because that's what I set up as in my preferences here. A border of 5mm was added, and now I have a preview of the imposed document. And what I can do is, if I see here that the imposition was done correctly, I can again drag that file on top of whatever I want to do with that file here. So I could, for example, generate an internet publishing document, a downsampled RGB version in my example setup. Clicking the X here closes the imposition preview again, and I can go back to my thumbnail preview. So this is in very brief overview are the functionalities that you have within tFlow production. You have a system that is very easy to work with on the front end side, where files will come into a hot folder and are automatically corrected and checked by the input queues, where you'll be able to look at what goes wrong, if anything goes wrong, and see the different errors that were generated, and then either accept or reject the file. If you want more information, you can also look at the full pre-flight report. So all of those things, of course, are possible as well. But in essence, files come in automatically or pre-flighted automatically, and you have a decision on whether they are good or not good. They then end up in the archive that you can browse in different ways. And either through an automatic process or because you drag and drop them on top of one of these output queues, files can then be sent to one of the output processes, output queues that are defined in tFlow production. So a very easy to use automated workflow application if you want. Now, that's the explanation about the turbine, which is the background processing engine, and tFlow production, the front-end application to work with this. Of course, these two don't have to run on the same system. I'm running everything on my Mac here because that's easy in a demo environment. But of course, you could run the turbine on a server that is in the basement somewhere, and I can have my front-end application running on a MacBook on my desk. And of course, I can make that connection with the turbine from different systems with different people. So I can have one turbine that does all of the processing on the server system, and then connect to that turbine from different computers to look at the files, decide whether they are good or not good, and send them to the output queues that I want to send them to. Now, what I said in the beginning was that I would also show you a way to integrate an Adobe InDesign environment with tFlow production, and that's the next thing that I want to do. If I open up Adobe InDesign, in this case I have CS6 running, but this also works under the new Creative Cloud version of InDesign. If I have InDesign running, I can install an InDesign plugin that is called tFlow Production Connector, and that connector gives me a little window that allows me to connect to a tFlow production system. And the first thing I would have to do is go to Settings. Under Settings, I can specify where the turbine runs that I want to connect to. Again, here it is specified to be on my system, which makes sense in a demo environment. Typically, this would be the IP address or the name of the server computer that is running turbine. Once you've entered that information, you can log on, and it shows me here that it is logged onto the tFlow production system. And once I've done that, I can go back to job. I'll open an example job by clicking on the Tucana logo here. And with an InDesign file that is open, I can now do two things. First of all, I have a list of all of the different PDF export settings that are available to InDesign on my system. And I could select one of these settings and click on Preview PDF to generate a PDF file and open that PDF file in my default PDF application, which, as you can see, is Preview, which is probably not the best choice in a graphic arts environment, but that's how my system happens to be set up. But it simply opens up the PDF in whatever application you have selected for PDFs. Once I'm happy with that PDF that is generated, I can select a queue on the tFlow system, and you can see that all of the queues that I have in tFlow production that we just saw, all of those queues are available here, and I could select the CMYK queue, for example, and then say, send this document to tFlow production. This will go through the same PDF generation process that we just saw. So it will generate a PDF file. It will send that PDF file to tFlow production, and you can see that it changed to queued. The status of this file changed to queued, and then it's now changed to processing and at 0%. And if you would look at the turbine and at the log file that you have in the turbine, you'll see that this file is picked up and that it is now waiting to be processed in PDF Toolbox because it's going through the input queue processes that I've set up for the CMYK input queue. Now, this will take a second to do that. Once the file is processed through the same interaction with tFlow production as before, it will query the amount of errors that were generated, warnings, and fix-ups. So basically, you can send from within InDesign, send a file to the tFlow production system. You can see what the status is of that file as it is being processed by tFlow production. And as soon as it is pre-flighted there, you'll see the actual errors and warnings pop up. The errors and warnings as they were reported by tFlow production. So this would be a way to very quickly see from within InDesign whether that job that you sent to tFlow production made it through the workflow and was actually a good job that generates no more errors and warnings, or if something is wrong that you might have to modify in InDesign and then send a new file to tFlow production. We saw last week that the same possibilities existed with tFlow approval, where you can also connect from within InDesign or Illustrator to a tFlow approval system, submit a file directly to tFlow approval, and then immediately get feedback from people. So this is the same kind of setup for tFlow production that you have here. It's still processing that document. Once it's done, you'll see the status change here, but there we go. So there is in this case one warning and 5 different things that were fixed to the file. And if I go to results and I go to warnings, you'll be able to see it needs to still update, but you'll be able to see which warnings were reported, which fixes were done on the file, and so on. If you go back to tFlow production, of course, the same will happen there. You'll see that the file is added to the list of files. The preview is still being generated here. But you'll get the same overview of errors and warnings as you would see in the plugin webinar. So what you see on my screen at the moment is the turbine application, and as you can see, it's relatively simple. This is meant to set up the whole system, and you have a number of tabs at the top that show you different pieces of information about your tFlow production system. The first tab is a log where you can see what kind of actions happen in the application. If there is anything that goes wrong, if errors occur, then you'll see that those errors appear in the log as well. The setup tab, and I'm actually going to stop the turbine so that we can see this a little better and so that we could change things in the setup tab if we wanted to. The setup tab, you have a selection for the language and then definition of the various folders that are used by a tFlow production. The most important part perhaps is the fact that tFlow production keeps all documents that come inside in a repository, an archive if you want. And you can, of course, here select what folder, what location that archive will be stored at. We'll talk much more about this archive and what the various options are around the archive when I look at the front-end application. But for now, just remember that there is a setup tab in the turbine where you can configure many of these details. tFlow production is capable of interacting with the approval system. We saw last week that tFlow approval is a web-based approval and collaboration system. Well, that web-based system can either work by itself or it can be connected in the background to a tFlow production system. And if you want to connect those, then this is actually the place to do that. So in the turbine, what I've done here is provide the URL to the tFlow approval system, our demo system that we have running as well. And I have selected which of the input queues, and we'll come back on that concept as well, which of the input queues are published towards the approval system. Information provides me with information about the license, the versions that are used mostly, and the networking setup that I'm working with. And when I mentioned license, that is of course on the licenses tab, where you can fill out your own information, where you can also see which options are enabled and where you can activate the solution if you have purchased it or if you requested a trial. Hot folders allows you to specify which hot folders will be looked at by tFlow production. Again, you can see the input queues on the left-hand side here. You can see output queues on the right-hand side. Again, I'll come back to those concepts once we start looking at the front-end application. But for each of those, there is a way to set up one or more hot folders that will be checked by tFlow production. And by default, there is a default folder where tFlow production creates all hot folders. What you can see here, there is an amber light in front of the first line. That means that this hot folder is not active. I've deactivated it, and I have defined my own hot folder for each of these input and output queues. Creating a new hot folder in here is very simple. The only thing I need to do is go to the Finder and drag a folder into the list of hot folders. And from that point on, tFlow production will treat that folder as a monitored hot folder. And then the last tab, send message, allows me to send a message to all of the clients that are connected, so the front-end application people that are connected to the turbine. Let's say that I want to do maintenance, just as what I've done here, and I'm going to stop the turbine. Then I can use the send message functionality to notify people that I'm going to do this, and their connection with the turbine will be interrupted.